All right, everyone, welcome to the Pangburn Q&A. Today our guest is Dr. Wilson from the YouTube channel. Really starting to gain some traction. Debunk the Funk. I really suggest everyone go and check it out. The kind of the premise behind the channel is to kind of debunk the bad science going on out there and illuminate the good science, as decided by Dr. Wilson and his interpretation. So let's kick off this Q&A. John, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks, Trav. I appreciate it. I think a decent place to start. I'm sure we'll get into the weirder stuff. I think for most of the people that I talk to, the greatest concerns that I still encounter, and I feel them myself personally, and this is topical given what we were just talking about, regarding vaccination in particular, is with children.
Mhm.
And regardless of whatever conclusions you can draw from all of the evidence that we have, there's I think a reasonable level of apprehension when it comes to exposing children to COVID vaccines, and it's less because that there's specific evidence to point to say, okay, this is why I think that we shouldn't. It's more about this, the potential, and quantify this however you want, the potential unknown. How
Mhm.
how do you address that? And what's the appropriate way to just sort of engage in that discourse?
Yeah, so potential unknown. So what do you mean by potential unknown? Is this like um a long-term effects kind of concern, or is there something else there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it would be more long-term effects, right? Because right now I think we know a lot about what the short-term effects could or would be, right? And let's just say we all agree that the relative risk is small. What do you say to someone that says, "I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical professional, but what
Mhm.
if we find something in 5 to 10 years?" I understand that we have reason to believe that we won't, but um, the risk of COVID disease for kids is obviously lower than it is for older folks. So I understand that there's concerns around things other than hospitalization and death for children. But what if these vaccines what if we determine in the future? What if we find out they have unintended consequences? Let's say I believe everything that I'm being told.
Sure.
What do I do then, right?
Sure. So it's useful to look at the history of vaccine safety and kind of the mechanisms there. So with every single vaccine, uh, almost every single adverse event that we have associated with vaccines occurs within 8 weeks of the dose actually being given, right? So we've never had a situation where it's a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, and we're seeing effects that the vaccines are causing. And the reason for that is the adverse events are either caused by the ingredients of the vaccine, for example, if you're allergic, um, or by your own immune response to the vaccine, can sometimes cause adverse events. Just like how in the disease COVID, your immune response to COVID is causing a lot of adverse events. Um, and so that initial immune reaction, that doesn't last months, years. Uh, that lasts a matter of weeks. So after that initial immune reaction has happened and you have now immune memory, um, there's no biological reason to believe that it's going to progress to something else is going to come up, right? And so the other aspect to that is if someone's saying like, what if 5 years from now, what if? Um, a useful question to ask is, so when do we know enough, right? When do we know that we should be using uh, these vaccines? Because we can look at what's happening now and we can see that although yes the risk is less for children, the risk is not zero, and the negative effects increase as time goes on if nothing is done about it, right? So during this Omicron wave, a lot of younger children still aren't vaccinated, and so there were a lot more cases in that age group as opposed to previous waves, and we saw greater rates of hospitalization in those age groups. So do we look at that now and say, oh, well, we have to keep waiting. We have to keep waiting until we get more data? When do we know enough, when we can see that of all those hospitalizations, almost none of them were vaccinated people, vaccinated children? You can see the numbers for that. They're extremely low. So those are the kinds of points that I would usually go to if someone were concerned about long-term effects of vaccines, particularly in children.
Great. Do you have a quick follow-up there, John, or are you good for now?
No, I'm good. I want to make sure everybody has enough time. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Appreciate
definitely. Let's go to Dave. Dave, you're up.
Yeah, sure. I suppose that there's a number of things that I would like to ask, but some of my primary concerns that were raised by, it wasn't the first time that after listening to the Joe Rogan podcast with Dr. Malone, some of the things that he said that I found most concerning. Obviously, it's a 3-hour podcast, but there were a couple of points. There were some things he said, and I watched your video after the podcast as well, and I thought it was good. But there were some things he said that I thought kind of went unrefuted by anybody that I've seen do the debunking videos of Dr. Malone. And the things that I find most concerning, and the first is this issue of spike in the bloodstream, where purportedly one of the reasons, not the reason, but one of the reasons that the vaccines were safe is that the spike was specifically engineered not to cleave off the cell wall and travel through the bloodstream. It's supposed to stay in the arm. And then now we know that it actually does leave the bloodstream, and it goes all over your body and can pass through the blood-brain barrier and so on. And I think in your video you said it's nothing, it's picograms. And I did read the paper linked there, which detected the concentration. But my concern is, like, is that toxic or not? Because it might be picograms, but I don't know if that is toxic or if it's not toxic. I mean, the entire dose is micrograms, so we're talking about tiny quantities all over the place. And if it's not toxic, then why was the fact that this wasn't going to happen one of the reasons that the vaccines were said to be safe? And isn't it true that now that we know that it does happen, doesn't that make them less safe?
So I don't think that the original mutations to the vaccine, the 2P mutation is what you're referring to, to the spike protein in the vaccines. I don't think that was originally intended to keep the spike protein from getting into the bloodstream. It was originally intended to make it more immunogenic. So the mutation kind of locks it into this up conformation, we call it, a conformation that it takes before it's ACE2, and that appears to make a more robust immune response for various reasons. But the amount of spike that gets into the bloodstream, you would expect that to happen with any vaccine. You'd expect some amount of it to make it into the bloodstream. The amounts have not been shown to be toxic or pathogenic. So in the studies in animals where they got bigger relative doses than what a human would get, they didn't see any toxicity caused by the vaccines in those cases. They only saw toxicity when larger amounts of spike protein were injected intravenously, not intramuscularly. we just haven't seen any evidence that the amount of spike produced from the vaccines is significantly toxic in any way. And compare that to a SARS-CoV-2 virus that is actively replicating, producing spike protein. I don't think you would want that without any form of previous immunity granted to you by the vaccine. Let's see. You mentioned crossing the blood-brain barrier. I think there are some papers that address that in one of the links I provided in the description. It's called ByramBridle.com. It's like a kind of a joke title because Byram Bridle is one of the guys who promotes those kinds of ideas. But it was made by somebody who was just like addressing all of his ideas with citations for each one. That website has a lot of good resources for addressing those kinds of claims that spike might be dangerous because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. Excuse me. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, great. Dave, do you have any follow-up to that?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of ask you again about. So you said that the design is not a safety feature. It was supposed to be to increase the immunogenicity. I think is the term you used. Where
yes,
it was supposed to stick. So I thought that I'd read in one of the papers that you cited in your video, the author was saying that there was concern about the spike protein cleaving off and being detected in the bloodstream because it was said to be safe because this wouldn't happen. One of the reasons it was said to be safe. Are you saying that maybe I'm misremembering this paper? I'll have to go look at it again. But I had really thought that it was touted as a safety feature or a feature that made it safe. So I guess the concern for me is that now that let me ask this question another way. Sorry. What does it say about the testing? So you said all the normal tests were done. The tests weren't skipped.
Right.
They were just done in parallel, kind of like. And I'm wondering why then, because for me, I'm wondering why this wasn't detected when this was engineered as a feature to not occur. Because it was engineered as a feature in either case that it wouldn't cleave off. It's supposed to, whether it's to increase immunogenicity or it's a safety feature. I've heard both now. But I'm wondering if all the normal tests were conducted, how this couldn't be detected, because it happens in a pretty significant percentage of the population. I think the paper you cited in your video is a 3 in 14 were detected to have this concentration in the bloodstream. So I'm thinking, here's a technology. It was engineered specifically to not do X, and yet in 25% or 20% or whatever it is of people that get the vaccine, it actually does do X. And this was missed in the medical. I just find that it was missed while the normal tests were not good.
I don't.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. I don't have memory of that being the specific intention. And it was, to my knowledge, caught in animal trials when they were looking at basically the pharmacokinetics of the vaccine contents. So let me. There's a really good episode of This Week in Virology where they had one of the scientists on who designed that mutation and did a lot of the initial with it. And he can describe kind of a lot of the motivations and what it actually does. I can look for that and link it to you. I think that would help clear up.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. I'd
more
love
of
to
your
listen to it.
questions. So I
Thank
can
you.
look for that in the meantime. But yeah, no problem.
Yeah, if you can find it, that'd be really cool. Thanks, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll find that. We'll make sure we get that to Dave, and I'll also post it if you can send it to me too when you do come across it, Dan. I'll also post it in our COVID-19 tab in the Pangburn library. Thanks, Dave. Let's go to Doolittle, Dr. Doolittle, for the prospectus. You're up,
Yeah,
man.
hi. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of questions, but I wanted to ask you about your own sort of decision making. You have your own child, as do I. I'm actually really happy that we have this new technology where we can deliver mRNA, type technology to our cells to actually have therapy without having to necessarily make, let's just say, our chemicals outside of our body, but have this use our own internal factories to turn on and do things that are beneficial to us. I'm really happy that we have this technology, but I'm also a little bit hesitant with giving the vaccination to my daughter, who's
Right.
of age where she's developing her own sexual organs, I guess, in that development stage.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
the only thing that I think that's an existential risk is maybe if there was a sudden death kind of a thing with the vaccine, or if there was a something that caused sterility. I mean, I think those are really the only real risks that haven't been totally run to ground.
Okay.
And to you as a father, what do you think is the break even as a decision point? What's the break even age where you should give the vaccine to your children, and they have a lower risk of death due to the vaccine, death or sterility, lower risk of death or sterility due to the vaccine versus a life-threatening risk from the virus? Like, what's the break-even age that you think the data tells us we ought to, let's just say, not give the vaccine to otherwise healthy young individuals?
I mean, I would want to get my child vaccinated at any age. Um, there's no risk at all of sterility occurring from these vaccines. That has not been observed. It's been tested for, it's been looked for. There are multiple programs such as VSafe that are specifically designed to look into things like that. And VSafe called my wife after she had her baby, and after she had her baby and was obviously vaccinated while pregnant. So they do all the follow up to look for trends like that. I know that there were some myths about COVID vaccines causing sterility that were perpetuated last year. Those hold no water. The idea was that the spike protein has motifs on it that look like a protein that forms the placenta, and that if we were to become immune to spike protein, we would become autoimmune to proteins that make the placenta, and thus a woman would become sterile. And that's not, it doesn't make any sense because we don't even see that for COVID infection, because you would expect to see that if someone were infected with something that makes spike protein, you would expect to see that effect. We don't. So there's no reason to be worried about sterility. And I can provide you, any reading or anything you might want to look at in that regard. And in terms of balancing risk, um, like I said, I would vaccinate at any age. There's actually for the youngest kids, in the 5 to 11 age group, for example, there were really, I'm trying to remember the actual numbers. There are very frequent ACIT meetings about these things where they discuss these kinds of risks. I don't remember there being any serious adverse events in that age group for COVID vaccines. Partly because the dose is lower. That's likely one reason that they're able to reduce the risk of adverse events. But yeah, whenever we're able to vaccinate my daughter, I'm not going to hesitate to do it, because although the risk is rare, I mean, I know children who have been in the hospital for COVID. It's not a fun time at all, and I don't know what I would do with myself if uh, that were to happen with my daughter. So I would want to prevent that any way possible. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded.
No,
hopefully that helps.
it's all good.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Did you have any follow up there?
Yeah, I don't know on the risk of sterility. That it's one of those weird things where I always hear a debunk of it, and the debunk is always about the placenta argument. And I've never heard a claim on the placenta argument in the first place, but I hear the debunk of the placenta argument. I've never heard the placenta argument. The argument that I always hear is that in the bio distribution, what do you what the pharmacokinetic study the pharmacokinetic study that they did when they were first getting the vaccines approved, they did like they inject a vaccine in I guess it was rats, and then they would take samples of organs of the rats periodically for a certain amount of time, and in those pharmacokinetic studies, the concentration of these are the lipid nanoparticle vaccines, not the adenovirus vaccines. The concentrations of lipids that they were measuring in the ovaries of the rats were still increasing at an increasing rate when they stopped the study and said there's no harmful concentration of lipid nanoparticles in the ovary. So I looked to me like they just stopped looking, and that's why they didn't find anything. But I think that on a broader perspective, 2 years in, we're not seeing a big reduction in birth rates or fertility. Probably a lot of it's because when would you expect there to be damage? It would be a pretty short window. So I think it's really hard to debunk, but I think there's still a concern, but it's like, I don't know how big the concern needs to be. Maybe we just need 10% of our population to remain unvaccinated, if you're really worried about it. And then if you're right, then you can be the only ones left on Earth that are reproducing. And and that's one of those weird things about diversity, where maybe everyone making different decisions for different reasons is going to save us with these big unknowns.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I totally understand being concerned. Even me, I debunking this stuff all the time, going in to get my daughter her vaccinations. Of course, still that nagging thing way in the back of my head, like oh man, it's like it's not an adverse reaction tomorrow. But I never actually hesitate to do it. But I understand that nagging worry in your head, and it's totally like understandable. But with the rat study again, the concentration of lipids that actually went to the ovaries was, even though it was increasing towards the end of the study, it was still really minuscule. And those lipid particles, I mean, they are just mostly the same stuff that your cell membranes are made out of. So those lipid nanoparticles, to make sure that they weren't toxic, because they were toxic when they were first attempted to be used for the purpose of vaccination. They had to be modified to be made safer. And so there's, they were able to look at the tissue, the actual ovary tissue itself, see that it wasn't damaged, it wasn't showing any abnormal signs, and the amount there was so small that that's completely what they would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could totally put that all to rest by taking some people that are 12 to 14 that have gotten the vaccine and taking samples of their ovaries and saying, "See, it's fine." Just a retrospective.
Excuse me, if I may ask a question.
Yeah, Fate, is it relating to what we were just talking about?
Oh no.
Yeah, I'll get to you in a minute. I want to move through because we got we got 45 minutes or 40 minutes left here. There's some people before you. Don, do you have a question for Dr. Wilson?
No, it's just intriguing to hear your expertise and the research you've done, and I'm just listening. But thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to John J. Parker, one of our weekly show hosts. Go ahead, John. Do you have a question?
I have the hint of a question.
Okay.
So yeah, very nice to meet you, by the way. I did watch your video, and I thank you because while I don't think I agree with you completely, you did save me from some of the more egregious stuff Malone said. So appreciate that. Anyway, here's my question, and it's not about the medical stuff because I don't know anything, because I'm not trained, but it's more of a social policy question. So you said something during the interview about how you kind of just wish Malone had never had that interview and how people weren't exposed to misinformation because then they make decisions that might be bad for their health. And I'm going to say some premises here, and if you think the premises are wrong, say that in the answer, but it's just necessary for my question to make sense, is that there's been multiple examples of the mainstream accepted scientific institutions that are more trustworthy than rogues like Dr. Malone, being wrong and having to eat their words, like occasionally, like in terms of maybe how effective the masks are against Omicron, like the paper ones as opposed to N95s, which absolutely work, or for maybe vaccines efficacy against transmission as opposed to preventing hospitalization and death. I guess basically my question is that why is your trust so high in scientific institutions that can also be wrong to such the extent that you would prefer that there is no questioning of it? Because sometimes the misinformation can absolutely be dangerous and absolutely hurt people, but sometimes those rogue people are just ahead of the curve. Don't people deserve the opportunity to take that risk and hear the information and decide for themselves? I mean, it's more of a scientific. It's not really a scientific question, but I was just kind of curious to get your thought on that. And if any of my premises are wrong, please correct me.
No, I know what you mean. So first of all, I guess I'll talk about scientific figures in the mainstream media getting stuff wrong. Science is okay with being wrong. We expect to get a lot of things wrong on the way to getting right answers. With the mask thing in particular, it was just really a change in recommendations lately for Omicron and cloth masks. We knew that certain N95 masks work better than cloth masks, but now there's just a specific preferential recommendation dates of N95s over cloth masks. So things are going to change. Things are going to evolve as we learn more, and that's okay in science. So talking about why trust scientific institutions and all that stuff. So I think that if a person it's important to ask a question of, are they trying to actually convince their colleague? Something? Are they just trying to convince the public of something? Because if an earnest scientist like a Galileo, like a something like that, is trying to kind of overturn the conventional wisdom, the best way to do that is with data. If you can get enough good data, enough good repeatable data, then science will follow suit. And if that person is not trying to convince their colleagues, their peers, that they have the data to overturn that conventional wisdom, and instead they're just going to the public, trying to win the public over, that's not a good sign. So, could a rogue person be right? It could, but it's not likely. The Galileo gambit doesn't really work out for the Galileo person very often. But through all of it, it's best to just look at data. I don't trust Fauci. I don't any more than I trust, anybody really. I care about what the data say. If Fauci back early in the pandemic said, sure, wear 2 masks, I'm not going to immediately go wear 2 masks. I'm going to say, okay, show me data that 2 masks offers a reasonable benefit as opposed to 1 mask. Likewise with boosters. I didn't get my 3rd dose until, when was it? It was just after Christmas. I got my 3rd dose of COVID vaccine, because before then, all the data that I was seeing said that 2 doses were good enough to prevent hospitalization and death. But then over time, we learn more, we see more data, and we see that a 3rd dose really does help round out immunity. And so, going with the data over one particular person is what I would try to do. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in the same ballpark. Thanks.
Okay. Awesome, John. Let's go to Michaela. Do you have a question for Dr. Wilson?
Hi. Yeah, I do have a question. My question is about, I suppose, the efficacy of masks in in combat sports. That's the word I'm looking for. So I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm the only person in my gym who wears a mask. I have a cloth mask with N95 filter inside. I wore one before the pandemic because I'm on like long-term steroids, and I worry that that's like weakening my immune system without me realizing it. And I get such a hard time from people online, like, why are you rolling with a mask? You have a sweaty guy on top of you. You really think that's gonna help? And it's like, yeah, because like, guess what? He's not sweating out COVID-19, is he?
Yeah. Wow.
So I just wondered what your thoughts about that were.
Yeah, I mean, geez, especially if if you're on long-term steroids, I would say, I mean, I don't know of any studies that have looked at that situation, but with all that we know about masks, it's definitely safe to say that you're getting some protection there, right?
I hope so.
So yeah, I mean, you can think about this conceptually, like, especially you said you're wearing like a tight-fitting mask, N95
Yeah, it's
filter,
like,
or
yeah. So, and then it has like the ear loops, but then I also just like tie it to my face with like like a tie that I took out of grappling shorts.
Okay, that's so interesting. Wow. So yeah, so if you're in a room full of people, they're all breathing hard, and one of them has SARS-CoV-2, and they're shedding virus, they could be shedding aerosols of virus into the air, and those aerosols float around. And over time, the more they shed, the higher concentration of SARS-CoV-2 in the air you're going to have in the room. So if your mask is, catching all of those wet aerosol particles that are floating in the air that you can't see, then that's offering you some protection. So some mask is better than no mask, whatever the situation.
Awesome.
I can't apply a number to it, but yeah, it's definitely giving you some protection in that situation. So don't worry about what they say. My wife got a lot of grief when she was the only person wearing a mask at her dance classes. Yeah, just protect yourself. Look out for you.
Just jujitsu them right in the face.
Yeah.
I got kind of kicked in the face by a white belt today, but it was
Ouch.
okay.
Well, you have all your teeth still. That's nice. Let's go to Kapowski next. Kapowski, do you have a question for Dr. Wilson? Not to be confused with Mr. Wilson.
That's my dad.
Kapowski's not there. Let's go to Fateh. Fateh, you have a question?
Yeah. Hello. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. So, excuse me. My question has a bit of a preamble, to it, so it may take me a few moments to run through. But I read this article on National Geographic, which documented. Well, it was just from one scientist from one perspective. But it documented the virus in chickens that causes Marek's disease, and how before the vaccines were developed for this disease, that the virus was less virulent and less lethal, and once the vaccine was developed, the virus became mutated to become more lethal and more virulent, and so all chickens must now be vaccinated with it, at a risk of dying without it, instead of it being just a this was over the course of about multiple decades, and so and then I would also like to talk about Geert van der Bosch. If I don't know if you're familiar with him, but his he's a pretty active proponent against the vaccinations, and his research or his theories. I'm not sure if he's ran any experiments, but his theories basically run as such that the vaccines are sort of genetic therapy, right? And they will develop only one specific antibody for the they will develop one specific instance of the spike protein, and then the antibody will be developed in the shape against that specific antibody, and then due to the course of natural selection, the only viruses that will survive are the ones that will that have changed to a different shaped spike protein, and so the spike so that it will have to change, and then there will be a and also it will have to change. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit inebriated. It will have to change to infect more hosts, and also that so we'll have to keep developing these booster shots, and that the vaccine will eventually become ineffective against any older version of the virus, and that we'll have to keep getting boosters, and that change the spike protein, and then also that there is a that the natural antibodies, which a lot of vaccine scientists don't study it as well as the vaccine the vaccine developed antibodies, that are specific towards a specific pathogens. These natural antibodies won't be able to attach to the virus when it has already been attached to a antibody that that was developed by an older vaccine. So and this is why we've seen some people that have gotten the older vaccines, the original vaccines, had a higher lethality to the
Can you
Delta
summarize
variant,
the questions, Fateh? just
to
just
the
because we are
Omicron
running
variant?
short on time. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes. So, do you believe that generally because of natural selection that the vaccines will cause more virulent and more lethal strains of COVID to develop?
No. So I've actually done, I think, videos on my channel now on Gert Van Bosch. Um, so starting off with the Marek's disease in chickens, the reason that we saw increased virulence with that disease in chickens is because the vaccine did not prevent, uh, did not promote of the virus from the chickens. So it just prevented disease. Um, so the virus was able to infect chickens and continue to replicate inside the chicken without it being cleared. So it was able to essentially mutate faster because it wasn't getting eliminated by the immune system. This is not what happens with COVID vaccines. So we have seen that vaccinated patients clear the virus faster than unvaccinated patients. This was shown. This has been shown now. It, uh, referred to as the Singapore study, published last year, um, where you could see over time the virus was cleared faster in vaccinated patients compared to unvaccinated patients. And we've also seen now more recently that there's less infectious virus in a vaccinated patient than in a unvaccinated patient. So those two results kind of square with each other. So it's not a comparable situation to Marek's disease for that reason. And then in terms of evolution and natural selection, when your body mounts an immune response to the spike protein, it's not just one antibody. Uh, there are multiple different sites on the spike protein that can be recognized by antibodies. And so your body will produce several different antibodies that can recognize different sites on the spike protein. And these antibodies have been characterized in several papers published in Cell and other journals. So we know that there are lots of different antibodies that bind spike. So in order for all of the antibodies to be rendered useless against SARS-CoV-2, then all of those sites would have to mutate. And that's a high bar of mutation for a virus to meet. On top of that, we also have T cells. So T cells are part of the immune system that are going to recognize the spike protein in ways that are different than antibodies. There's a lot of biology there, but to summarize, the ways that T cells recognize these proteins is also going to be different from person to person, right? So the ways that my T cells recognize spike protein might not be the same as how your T cells recognize it. And the biology behind this has to do with, you know, matching transplant patients, for example, right? Everybody's immune system works a little bit differently. So that's another bar for the virus to jump over in terms of evading the immune system that the vaccines grant. So yeah, go. That's basically it.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Fateh. Thanks for the question. Let's Scott, are you back?
Yep, I just got back. So I did have a question. It sounds like you have some sort of expertise in virology. What I know might be a little bit off topic, but going down the road or down the line of mRNA vaccines, how effective do you think these things might be against like zoster or like HSV1 and HSV2? Do you think it's going to be giving us new treatments for viruses that have already that humans have been living with for a long time that we haven't come up with ways to deal with yet?
So yes, the answer to that is we'll see, right? we don't really know big of a how big of a boost to previous vaccine problems that mRNA vaccines are going to give us.
Yeah.
We're just going to have to wait and see. Moderna is starting their mRNA vaccines against HIV. They're starting those trials. So we can hope, but as far as like making actual predictions, it's really hard to at this point because, especially with HIV, which is such a difficult thing to vaccinate against.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see soon, hopefully.
Well, because I know, haven't they been working on like mRNA for like zoster for a long time? Like 10,
Um,
12 years now at this point.
for
Uh,
yeah, chicken pox. I don't know actually. I'm not aware of that. They might have been. I would imagine though that those efforts might have been stalled, mostly because of money. So we already have vaccines that work against chickenpox. So companies might have been reluctant to fund uh, the very expensive research that would be required to advance mRNA vaccines in that context.
yeah.
Another reason why with COVID it was such an opportunity for mRNA vaccines because when you're trying to develop a new vaccine against something new where there's no other pre-existing vaccines, um, you know, that's the time to take chances and try new technologies
Yeah.
for these companies because otherwise they don't want to dedicate money to, oh, okay, we're just going to make this vaccine a little bit better and we have to spend billions of dollars doing clinical trials. That doesn't sound great to our board, so
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
guess, yeah, probably like the amount of people that get shingles like is probably not that much compared to like the money that they would make off having a vaccine for zoster.
Yeah, and we do have there were two shingles vaccines. One beat out the other. But yeah, that's another. We have a working shingles vaccine, so yeah, companies I don't imagine would be too excited about making it better.
All right, thanks, Scott. Let's go to you, Lexicon, and then we'll go to Don, and then we'll see where we're at for time.
Hey, I only got one question. I know it's typically not a great idea to intentionally take the same vaccine twice in a row right away. Is there any risk if for someone who recently had COVID to go and get vaccinated right away?
I think that if you're sick, it's recommended that you don't get vaccinated while you're sick. But after you recover, I don't think that there's any recommendation on how long you should wait for health reasons. You definitely want to double check that because I'm not sure off the top of my head how true that is. But as far as I know, there's no reason to wait to get vaccinated as long as you've recovered.
All right, let's go to Don. You had a question?
Yes, I do actually have a question. As someone who this is clearly your profession, what has been the most frustrating thing personally with dealing with with the type of misinformation and disinformation that has proliferated throughout the internet and the United States?
Most frustrating thing, I think the most frustrating thing would be to watch.
Fierce Tank, can you mute, please? Thanks.
It's I have a lot of patience for people who believe what might be called conspiracy theories and anti-vaccine things. So I think the thing that's most frustrating for me is watching leadership not learn as the pandemic goes on, right? for example, like there have been some nations where it's always a one solution approach. Cases go up, and then they don't do anything until cases get too high, and then they're like, let's lock down. Before that, they're all wishy-washy. They're like, please wear a mask, or remember to wash your hands. And then cases get too high, and boom, hard policy lockdown. And then cases go down. And then they're like, okay, we're done. We're good. And then cases go back up, and they're like, oh, we have to lock down again. And that's really frustrating to not see any long-term, like, sustainable solution implemented. And then that frustrates people and fuels distrust and thus more conspiracy theories. So that's what I think that's what comes to my mind as being most frustrating to deal with, is watching the leadership constantly fail and not learn.
That's a great question. Anyone else have a question? I know we haven't got to Bruno, Fierce Taint, or Jack yet. Do either of you guys have a question? Jack, do you have one? Okay, let's go with Jack's question. That'll be the final question, unless Bruno's got a quick one after.
No,
Perfect.
Was
it, you were just talking about conspiracy, so that works out pretty good for like kind of the route that this question goes. So lots of people have been tripping out about thinking stuff like actually, here's just the question: is there anything like graphene oxide instead of the vaccine being used as a vehicle for the mRNA?
No.
Okay, so yeah, I only ask because people make like this big Herculean leap in logic to think that like because there's graphene oxide, there's going to be ways that they can manipulate it, and they're going to 5G towers. And I've been arguing with people like personally that like I've looked it up in like every way that I can look it up on different search engines and everything. I'm like, there's no graphene oxide in this thing. And no, they're just like, oh nope, Alex Jones and all these other people, graphene oxide, it's going to manipulate your genes. And I'm like, okay, cool. So is there a vehicle right now for the mRNA in this one or no?
Yeah, it's the lipid nanoparticles.
Oh, okay. It's not okay.
Yeah.
So they're not using the nanotubes from the graphene oxide to do anything like that in the vaccines and stuff. Okay, cool. That's pretty much my entire question.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, I think
that's one of the weirder ones.
Well, I think we've put Dr. Wilson through the Pangburn Discord gauntlet here. We can let you go. Thank you so much for stopping by, and you can literally jump in and join us. We have evening discussions all the time, so feel free to stop by anytime.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. I enjoyed your
Thanks for,
talk, and I discovered your channel, which is going to be fun.
Thanks for having me back. Happy to help any way I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you, man.
Thank you.
Take it easy, guys.
All right. Have a good week, guys.
Yep.